Today, we're going to talk about how to get faster in the 400. And I'm not just going to look at what one coach says or one specific training program. I'm going to look at what the science says is the most effective way to improve 400 meter performance. Lots of people have lots of different strong opinions on this topic, but you might end up being surprised about the stuff that I found. In this video, I'll dive into multiple different research papers to cover the key factors that make up 400 meter performance, different ways to improve each of those qualities, compare some of the common methods used by top coaches to improve 400 meter performance, and then cover in detail how to implement all of this into your own training to run a new 400 meter personal best this year. Our first study is a 2008 article by Jürgen Schiffer called The 400 Meters. It opens by talking about how the 400 meter is a prolonged sprint, not an endurance event as some people think. For example, during Wade van Niekerk's world record 400 meter race, he ran the equivalent of 4 consecutive back-to-back 10.7600 meters. Maintaining such high velocities over such long distances is incredibly taxing on the body, which is one of the reasons that some people think the 400 is one of the toughest races in track and field. It also requires athletes to be able to maintain speeds near their max speed for very extended periods of time. In fact, 400 meters is just beyond the point that most well-trained athletes can maintain very high velocities, which is why you see such significant form breakdowns and slowing of athletes in the last 50 or so meters of the 400. Early on, a lot of coaches believed that the ideal type of athlete to race the 400 was a 400-800 hybrid athlete because of the higher levels of endurance that 800 meter athletes possess. In fact, multiple early world records were set by athletes in this category. But inevitably, sprinter types like Michael Johnson ended up taking over. He had a 19.32 second 200 meter world record and a 43.18 400 meter world record, which remains the second fastest of all time. He was surpassed only by Wade van Niekerk, who I mentioned earlier, who in 2016 became the first man to run a sub 10 second 100 meter, sub 20 second 200 meter, and sub 44 second 400 meter. So at this point, it is abundantly clear that to be a world-class 400 meter competitor, you need to have an incredible amount of speed. There are components of endurance, which we will talk about later, but if you're not fast, you're not going to be able to sustain fast speeds over 400 meters. Next, the article talks about pacing. A good 400 meter runner will open their first 200 about 1 second slower than their 200 meter personal best. A less experienced runner, on the other hand, might come out about 2 seconds slower than their 200 meter PB. So if you have put in a lot of high quality training, you can use this formula to predict your 400 meter performance. Your 200 meter personal best times 2 plus about 3.5. So for example, my junior year of college, I ran a 22.89 in the 200, multiply that times 2 and you get 45.78. Add 3.5, and you get an estimated 49.28. My personal best of the season was a 49.8, but I ended up splitting somewhere around a 48 mid and a 4x4, and I didn't get to run any 400s while I was at my true peak at the end of the season. So in my case, this was pretty close to accurate. Then comparing the first 200 meters to the second 200 meters, for top athletes, that will be about a 1.5 to 2.5 second difference on average. Typically, the best of the best athletes who reside between 43.8 and 44.9 seconds will have less of a differential when compared to athletes just below them in the 45 to 45.9 range. Then the article suggests a couple of race strategies, both of which center around maintaining a relaxed rhythm throughout the majority of the race. Finally, it lists characteristics of top 400 meter performers in order of performance. First, it has a high ability to produce energy through anaerobic glycolysis, also known as your anaerobic capacity. Then it has sprint speed. So with two athletes that have the same anaerobic capacity, the faster athlete wins. Next, it names superior alactic anaerobic capacity. So this refers to your ability to use your creatine phosphate system early in the race. This energy system usually lasts about 7 to 12 seconds and then is depleted. Next, it mentions high anaerobic power, which you can simplify to just power. And then last, it actually mentions that a very high VO2 max could be detrimental to performance, likely due to the fact that to develop a very high VO2 max, you have to take time and energy away from high intensity speed and power training. It gives some suggestions for training these qualities, the first of which is for the anaerobic alactic capacity, where it suggests high intensity runs of about 7 seconds, and the other is the anaerobic lactic system, where it suggests high intensity runs of about 7 to 20 seconds, 20 to 40 seconds, and 40 to 120 seconds. Quote, "Since the anaerobic lactic system is the most important energy system in the 400 meter race, specific endurance, speed endurance, and specific strength are the most vital areas to be developed in the quest for a maximal performance. However, the allied areas, such as speed, general endurance, and general strength, although not having a direct effect, must not be overlooked." While I do agree with a lot of what the article says, I feel like they are vastly underestimating the importance of speed. For example, if I was going to race an athlete who can run under 10 seconds in the 100, and they did absolutely no training over 100 meters for an entire year, while all I did was crank out reps of 200, 300, and 400 and had a great anaerobic capacity, I guarantee you they would still destroy me in the 400 any day of the week. Even though they might die out really early in the 400, their speed is still so much better than mine that I would have no chance of ever catching them in the race. At the very end of the article, they suggest Clyde Hart style workouts, which are generally very high volume and very low intensity, especially in the earlier parts of the year. They also incorporate lots of work that is under race pace. By under, I mean slower than, not faster than. Our next article is called Speed, Strength, Endurance, and 400-Meter Performance by Paulo Jorge Paxao Miguel and Victor Manuel Machado Reis in 2004. I just butchered every single one of those names, but anyway, this article looked at the differences between elite 400-meter runners and sub-elite 400-meter runners. This study looked at 15 male runners who were split into those running over 49 seconds and those running under 49 seconds. They used counter-movement jumps to assess explosive strength, 15 reactive jumps in a row to assess reactive strength, and a 30-second continuous counter-movement jump drill to assess speed, strength, endurance. The faster group jumped an average of 8.5 centimeters higher in the counter movement jump. They had roughly the same score in the 15 reactive jump test and had better overall jumps in the 30 seconds counter movement jump test, better jumps in the first 15 seconds of that test, and by a larger margin, even better jumps in the last 15 seconds of the counter movement jump test. Therefore, in this case, better 400-meter runners were shown to have both better explosive strength and better speed, strength, endurance. However, they didn't find any correlation between reactive strength and 400-meter performance. That isn't to say that there is no connection, but for whatever reason, the sub-elite athletes had about the same reactive strength as the elite ones. I don't really know why this was the case. It could have something to do with how they conducted the test or the particular group of athletes they decided to work with, but I found this result pretty surprising. The article then goes on to list a myriad of ways to improve your explosive strength performance and speed, strength, endurance. It names jumps with simultaneous or alternate short bounds, horizontal continuous bounds, drop jumps over hurdles, counter movement jumps, half squat jumps with 20 to 40% of body weight. Then it mentions weight training, specifically any load moved at maximum speed, and then mentions specifically squats and half squats, split squats, and step ups, which are relatively specific to the movement patterns used in sprinting. After that, it mentions technical exercises, which are used to improve sprinting technique and also have an effect on reactive strength because of the high amounts of ground contacts. So this is drills, skipping, fast rhythm exercises, progressive runs, exercises to improve running specific strength, including resisted sprinting and uphill sprinting, and even sprinting in the sand, which I wouldn't necessarily recommend, but it's an interesting idea. And then in terms of the speed, strength, endurance development, it seems there is some controversy regarding which method to use. The article goes on to suggest trying something like multiple rounds of squatting your 10 repetition maximum, followed by sprinting somewhere between 60 and 100 meters and repeating that 3 times, which is essentially doing some form of pre-fatiguing, followed by a very event-specific activity. I'm not sure how well the science supports this, but I think it's a really interesting idea, and it's also quite similar to something I read about in Steve Magnus's book, The Science of Running. I don't remember the exact details, but I know he mentioned some workouts such as a hard 200-meter rep followed by 50 to 100 meters of bounding. In his book, he discusses it in the context of developing a better kick at the end of a race. But essentially what you're doing is teaching your body to recruit muscle fibers in a relatively event-specific activity while under fatigue. Again, I think this is interesting and could have a lot of training implications, but it's not something I've personally experimented with, and I don't know how much the science supports it. Our last article is Important Determinants of Anaerobic Running Performance in Male Athletes and Non-Athletes by Numela, Miro, Stray Gunderson, and Rusko. The goal of this article was to discover overall qualities that create anaerobic running performance by looking at a group of 400-meter runners, middle and long distance runners, power athletes, and physically active men. They looked at a bunch of different qualities, including maximal power, peak blood lactate, power at 10 millimoles blood lactate level, counter movement jump height, VO2 max, and running velocity over 30 meters. To clear up a couple of these, maximal power is pretty self-explanatory. Peak blood lactate indicates what it sounds like, the amount of lactate you're able to build up within your bloodstream, and generally a higher peak blood lactate indicates a higher anaerobic capacity. Power at 10 millimoles blood lactate level is essentially a marker of how well you can perform while in a fatigued and acidic environment. So when you hear people exercising and they talk about feeling lactic acid building up, that's not really an accurate view of what's happening. Lactic acid or lactate is actually a fuel source that your body uses to produce energy, but in the process of producing energy anaerobically, which is without oxygen, which is what you have to do every time you're exercising at very high intensities, there are byproducts that are created. You use carbohydrates in a process called glycolysis to turn the carbs into ATP, which is your cellular energy. During that process, hydrogen ions are created as a byproduct, and those increase the acidity in the local muscular area that is exercising. That buildup of acidity contributes very highly to fatigue and starts interfering with your ability to contract your muscles. So anyway, all of that is to say that my understanding of the power at 10 millimole blood lactate level is really looking at your ability to produce power while your muscles are in an acidic environment. not because of the lactate, but because of the byproducts of the hydrogen ions increasing the acidity in your muscles while you exercise. And then the rest of these are fairly self-explanatory. What the study found was that maximal velocity over 30 meters, power at 10 millimole blood lactate level, and the difference between maximal power and VO2 max were the biggest differentiators between 400-meter athletes. Now, I don't necessarily think that this means that we need to set out to try to have the lowest possible VO2 max. I think it more specifically means that we want to have a very high anaerobic power production. So it's not a case of trying to get rid of the one, it's a case of trying to optimize the other. And you're always going to be able to produce more power anaerobically than you are aerobically. That's why high intensity, short duration activity uses methods of anaerobic energy production, while lower intensity, longer duration activities use aerobic power production. You can produce more total energy aerobically, but it's a lot slower. And so for high intensity, short duration things, you're always going to use anaerobic energy instead of aerobic. So put simply, your maximum speed, your ability to tolerate acidity, and your ability to produce power anaerobically are the most important factors for improving 400-meter performance. There are many ways to improve all of these, and I will just walk you through some of the basics. But just to be clear, for example, when I'm talking about speed, a lot of you probably know that getting in the gym and increasing your total force production can indirectly lead to you getting faster. But I'm not going to talk about indirect means of improving things. I'm just going to talk about the direct means of improving things. So speed has two components, which are acceleration and max velocity. Accelerations typically take place between 10 and 30 meters. The reason for this is that for most athletes, if it goes longer than this, they're no longer training acceleration and are instead training max velocity. A notable exception is in elite athletes who can take upwards of 40, 50, or 60 meters to reach their maximum velocity, who could extend these acceleration reps without actually training their max speed. Accelerations can be done from 2-point starts, 3-point starts, or block starts. Another way to improve acceleration is by doing hill sprints. Preferably, these would be over about 10 to 30 meters as well on a relatively gradual incline. If you get too steep, it'll start breaking down your mechanics and not be as effective at transferring to actual sprint performance. Similarly, you can do resisted sprints, again over roughly 10 to 30 meters on average. There are plenty of different ways to do resisted sprints, and people argue about what is most effective and even what is more dangerous, because some people think loads that are too high can interfere with your biomechanics. Typically with these, you're going to work in a velocity decrement zone of 60% or less, which is to say that under resistance, you only run 60% of the speed you would have run over the same distance if you were unresisted. If you have a way to time yourself, you can figure out exactly what this is. Otherwise, it's going to be super individual, but from what I've seen, it's generally going to be a load of about 80% of your body weight or less on a typical sled. Then we have max velocity. People typically are going to train max velocity with 10, 20, or 30 meter flies. And most commonly, these are going to be with rolling starts. The reason people use rolling starts is because it's a little easier to get up to max speed and requires less energy when compared to a static start. That has two advantages. One is that it really lets you isolate the quality of max velocity, and the other is that it allows you to do more reps than you would otherwise be able to do. If you're doing all your repetitions from a static start, it takes more energy and therefore will wear you out more quickly. You will also be able to train your max velocity by doing regular static start reps of 40 meters or above, depending on how advanced you are as an athlete. Most athletes, if they run a 40-meter sprint all out, will reach max velocity by the end of that sprint. Speed endurance, which is your ability to maintain your maximum speed over a longer distance, is generally trained by doing all these same things, but just extending them over longer distances. So instead of a 30-meter fly, it might be a 40, 50, or 60-meter fly, or instead of a 40-meter flat sprint, it could be 100-meter or 150 meters, or even higher, depending on what qualities you're trying to focus on. Also, it's worth mentioning that all of these acceleration things I talked about and all of these max velocity things I talked about are generally going to be done between 95 and 100% of your personal fastest speed. I've heard of some people going as low as 93%, but all of this depends on the time of year, your goals, your experience level, and more. But for most people, most of the time, you're going to be between 95 and 100% of your max speed. In my opinion, training these things is so much easier if you have a way of timing yourself. Some form of sprint timer allows you to track your progress, monitor how changes impact your sprint speeds, and also helps you keep track of how different volumes and training strategies affects your speed over the long term. I truly believe that if you train without some form of timing system, you could be making yourself slower the entire time and never have any clue. I've had many times that I ran a rep and I thought it was much faster than the other reps I had run so far, and it ended up being slower. And I've also had many times when I thought I ran a super slow rep and it was actually an all-time personal best. By having some way to get immediate feedback of your performance, it allows you to see things like what form cues work for you and what don't, how relaxed you need to be to run at your fastest speed, and more. That's why I am a huge fan of the app Photo Finish Automatic Timing. I've been using the app for a couple of years now to time my sprints, and I absolutely love it. All you need is 2 devices and an internet connection, and you can time your flies, your accelerations, your splits if you're doing a longer workout with multiple laps, and more. They offer these timing systems at at a fraction of the cost of more popular systems like the free lap timer, and I would highly recommend all of you check them out. Next, I'm going to talk about your ability to improve acid tolerance, or your ability to produce power in an acidic environment. There are 3 specific types of workout that come to mind for this, and that is intensive tempo workouts, special endurance 1 workouts, and special endurance 2 workouts. People sometimes use some of these terms interchangeably, but I am just going to use the definitions as I understand them. Intensive tempo is generally made up of long-ish runs, anywhere between 150 meters and even up to 600 meters, depending on the situation. These runs are typically done at 80 to 90% effort and done with long recoveries, but not complete recoveries. They are the big brother of extensive tempo workouts, which are very commonly used by sprinters on lower intensity days to get in some higher training volume and improve their aerobic capacity without dropping a huge loading and stimulus onto the system. The difference is extensive tempo is usually at 60 to 70%, while intensive tempo is between 80 and 90%. To be clear, intensive tempo sessions are a high intensity day. That means, like any other high intensity day, most of the time it shouldn't be just before or just following a different high intensity day. Speed Endurance 1 and Speed Endurance 2 are also high intensity days, but I view them a little differently. While intensive tempo might have slightly incomplete recoveries and be between 80 and 90%, Special Endurance 1 and Special Endurance 2, in my opinion, are usually at 93% intensity or higher and are done with complete recoveries. So while an intensive tempo session might be something like 4 by 200 at 85%, with 5 minutes rest, a Special Endurance 1 session might look like 3 by 200 at 95% with 15 minutes recovery. Special Endurance 2 is exactly the same, but typically over longer distances. An example of a Special Endurance 2 workout might look like 2 by 300 at 95% with 20 to 30 minutes of recovery. If you're paying attention, you might notice that a lot of the things I just talked about line up with the time-based training recommendations from the first article. So they mentioned the anaerobic alactic system being trained by high-intensity runs of about 7 seconds, and that is touched on by acceleration work, hill sprints, resisted sprints, and maximum velocity training that I talked about. Then they mentioned the anaerobic lactic system, composed of high intensity runs of about 7 to 20 seconds, 20 to 40 seconds, and 40 to 120 seconds. Regular speed endurance, which I mentioned a little bit, falls into that shortest category. Special Endurance 1 generally falls into the second, and Special Endurance 2 into the third of those categories. So it's pretty interesting how the stuff we've talked about so far matches up. Now we've got to talk about the difference between maximal power and VO2 max. And for the most part, everything we've talked about so far will increase your maximal anaerobic power, especially the shorter things like the acceleration work, the max speed work, the hill sprints, resisted sprints, etc. On top of that, things like plyometrics, strength training, and power training will improve your maximal power output and extend the difference between your maximal power and your VO2 max, thereby increasing the likelihood of you performing well in the 400. Now we have a pretty good idea of what the science says is important for 400-meter sprint performance. But how do we put all of that together? I think a great way to start is by looking at top coaches. Just to be clear, this is my understanding of what I think they do based on the things I have heard, seen, and read. I can absolutely misunderstand these things and make mistakes, and this may not be an accurate representation of these coaches. First, I'm going to talk about Mike Hurst and his concurrent style of training. Now, concurrent training refers to training endurance qualities and speed qualities at the same time all throughout the year. He talks about, in the context of late preseason training, doing speed on the first day, which could look something like 3 times 20, 30, 40, 50, and 60 from blocks, from standing, and then flying. He follows that up on a second day with a specific 400-meter endurance workout, such as 6 by 200 in sub 24 seconds with 2 minutes jog around recovery. He then follows that with an off day and then comes back with a special speed endurance workout, which might be something like 300, 250, 180, all run at max speed with longer than 15 minutes recovery. That day might be followed with some endurance work, like long hills with jog recoveries. Then that day could be followed with some tempo work, maybe something like 2 by 5 by 100 for form, rhythm, and relaxation. I've heard him refer to these workouts as race modeling workouts. Or this day could be made up of a pool session, and he would do lifting on the high intensity days. In this case, that is day 1, day 4, and day 6. Kevin Tyler is one of the coaches at Altus, who generally follows a short to long approach. Now, his approach is still kind of concurrent. He's going to have elements of everything included all year round, but especially in terms of the speed work and the general formatting, roughly speaking, it's a short to long approach. Now, I want to be super clear. He's mentioned he also trains some athletes long to short, and that it really depends on the athlete and the situation. But with most of his male athletes, he's doing a short to long program most of the time. Typically, he'll do 3 high quality sessions with a day of lower intensity work in between. So he might start out with a speed or speed endurance workout. His second high quality session might be intensive tempo between 80 and 85%. And his third high intensity session might be speed or special endurance, which is going to look a lot like the 400. So maybe this would be the workout I mentioned earlier of 2 by 300 with 20 to 30 minutes of rest. Days in between could be something like extensive tempo work, form work, possibly some lifting. He wasn't super clear about this, and so it probably depends a lot on the athlete and the specific situation. I will say he specifically mentioned that he thinks lifting is really important for early development of an athlete, teaching them to produce high levels of force, but that it may not be as important for more developed athletes. So if he's working with an elite sprinter, they may not do much lifting outside of some bare minimum stuff for injury prevention. Finally, I'm going to talk about Clyde Hart, who famously follows a long to short approach. This is a training plan written for a 400 meter runner with a 46-second PR. In the early season, like January through February, on Monday they might do 2 by 500 at 56 seconds through the 400 off of 15 minutes recovery, then 6 by 150 long hills, run fast with a jog back recovery, followed by weights. On Tuesday, they might do 8 by 200 in 28 seconds with 3 minutes rest, then 6 by 150 long hills again, fast with a jog back recovery, and weights. On Wednesday, they might do 4 by 300 in 42 seconds with 5 minutes of rest, then 3 by 200 in 30, 29, 28 with 3 minutes of rest, and then 6 by 10 second rope resisted runs, fast with 10 seconds of rest. On Thursday, they might do 350 meters run fast with 15 minutes of rest, and then 4 by 200 in 26 seconds with 5 minutes of rest, followed by weights again. And on Friday, 3 by 200 in 30, 29, 28 with 3 minutes of rest, and then 4 by 4 handoff work, followed by a meet on Saturday. Now, I personally think that the best method is really dependent on the situation and on the athlete. A lot of these coaches will mention that the physical demands for female athletes can be a little bit different for male athletes at the same level, because female athletes run for a little bit longer and therefore have more of an aerobic contribution. Long to short approaches can be very effective for highly developed athletes who are lacking endurance qualities. If you've got somebody who is incredibly fast over the 100 meter but has never run longer distances, doing something like this would allow them to touch heavily on their weak points and bring them up to match the rest of their physical abilities, and then probably compete very successfully over 400 meters. In my opinion, the important thing to keep in mind is that you've still got to touch on speed work. Traditionally, when coaches would do the long to short approaches, if they didn't touch on speed work, once they started adding it in later on, the risk of injury was incredibly high because the athlete's body wasn't used to the demands of max speed sprinting. On top of that, going months without touching on speed leads to an inevitable decrease in your ability to sprint fast. When sprinting fast is one of the most important determinants of 400 meter performance, ignoring it for months out of the year does not sound like a great idea. That's why, from what I understand, most coaches don't do this anymore, at least not in the traditional way. It's probably more likely for them to do a sort of concurrent version where they start with some longer distances and some higher volumes, but are still touching on speed work pretty consistently throughout the year. Short to long approaches, on the other hand, are very effective for less developed athletes. If you haven't done a lot of sprinting or are mostly untrained, then it makes a lot of sense to develop the ability to sprint over short distances first, and then slowly gain the ability to sprint over longer and longer distances over time. This is especially true because if you're not very well developed and you just start doing a lot of endurance style training, you're probably missing out on tons of potential speed and power adaptations that would be much more beneficial to you in the long term than just improving your endurance. That's because improving endurance is much easier than improving speed and power. So my personal take on all of this is that speed work should always be done in a short to long approach. Very early on in the year, I think you should start running short distances at maximal efforts and slowly extend those distances over time. Super early on, that might be something like 5 by 10 meter accelerations, whereas very late in the year, this might have morphed into special endurance 2 workouts, like the one I keep mentioning, 2 by 300 all out with 20 to 30 minutes of recovery. Then I think that extensive tempo is how you start building in endurance qualities and getting your body used to handling higher training loads while also developing some endurance qualities and aerobic capacity to prepare you so that later on you can begin intensifying those qualities and making them more specific to your favorite event. So with extensive tempo in particular, I believe you would start with low volumes at low intensities, slowly build up those volumes over time, and then slowly reduce the volumes before removing extensive tempo altogether. I also think that intensive tempo should be incorporated basically year-round, with the exception of the first month or two of training for 400 meter athletes. It may also get removed during some of the peaking stages, so that's something to keep in mind as well. Intensive tempo is a great way to create specific endurance without huge amounts of loading and fatigue. That makes it a safe and effective way to incorporate 400 meter specific training into your plan all year round without jumping straight into Special Endurance 1 and Special Endurance 2 work that will be incredibly taxing and really increase your risk of injury, especially overuse injuries. Special Endurance 1 and Special Endurance 2 are super important, but I think they shouldn't be incorporated until later on in the year as part of your speed work, like I mentioned earlier. Now, based on everything I talked about, here's one way you could set up a week of training for the 400. I have one set up for early in the year or the general preparation period, one for specific preparation, and one for the early competitive season. So if you take a look at the general preparation period, you'll notice it's pretty low volume across the board, maybe even lower volume than some people would recommend, but I wanted to start out with something really light to give an idea of how things might look super early in the year, especially for somebody who is less advanced or somebody like me who suffers with a lot of injuries. And so they have to start things as simply as possible to try to make sure they stay healthy and don't flare up any issues in their joints or connective tissues or anything like that. So we've got 2 higher intensity days with some sprinting, some plyos, some jumping and lifting, but everything is for the most part lower intensity. You could even start these out at less than 100%, although typically accelerations you're going to look at the 93 to 100% range, roughly speaking. Then we've got 2 recovery days that still have some training involved. Now, I wrote all the recovery days the same. They list multiple different modalities people use on recovery days, some of which have other purposes. So for example, general strength can of course improve your strength and coordination. It can also, as Bushexnator says, improve your endocrine fitness and lead to hormone releases that can actually improve your recovery in theory. I wouldn't actually recommend having extra extensive tempo at this point in the year, but if somebody was more advanced, they could, so I have that thrown in. And some other options would be biking or pool workouts, sort of lower intensity exercise that still gets the blood flowing. And of course, we have 2 days that are completely off and 1 day with actually written in extensive tempo training. And again, this is a very low volume of extensive tempo. A lot of 400 runners are going to end up doing a lot more than that. But since this is super early, I was trying to lay out a very basic week that somebody could start with and be pretty safe most of the time. Looking at the specific preparation period, you can see that the general layout is roughly the same, but now instead of there being 2 high intensity days and 1 low to moderate intense day, now it's 2 high intense days with 1 moderate to sort of high intense day. There's still 2 active recovery days that have the general strength and the extensive tempo or the pool work, all that kind of stuff. Again, because some top coaches think that that's really effective for promoting recovery and also touching on some of the qualities that we don't get to touch on the main higher intensity days. So some things like aerobic fitness and, like I mentioned before, endocrine fitness. Then both of these high intensity days are hybrid sessions. So the first day is acceleration and speed endurance. The second day is max speed work and special endurance. And then an intensive tempo day with some pretty typical 200 meter repeats like a lot of people do as 400 meter runners. And so this period is getting pretty heavy on lactate style training. There are basically 2.5 days that are really touching on that system. And I'm talking about the special endurance 1 day and the intensive tempo day. Now the speed endurance will a little bit, but I think everybody knows 150s feel a lot different than 300s and 200s. And you can see how compared to the general preparation period, these things are getting a lot more specific and everything's starting to look a lot more like actual 400 meter racing. Then finally, we have the early competition period. And you might notice that there's not any speed endurance or special endurance that I have written in. Well, there's a little bit of speed endurance, but no special endurance 1 or special endurance 2. And the reason for that is you have to keep in mind that the races you're running on meet day are fulfilling these requirements. If you're running a 400, you're running within 93% of your top end speed, and so it is a speed workout. If you're running a 200, it's definitely a speed workout. And of course, a 400 meets the requirements of special endurance 2. So if earlier in the week we're doing an intense special endurance session, and then we go and race, that's 2 very high intensity special endurance sessions within the same week while you're trying to be fresh enough to actually go out there and compete. So it's not to say that it can't be done, but it's something you got to be cognizant of, and there's a reason that I didn't do it in this week. Now you'll notice I still do have intensive tempo. I did that because it's early competition period, and some top coaches believe that by maintaining intensive tempo work during your weeks, not only can you continue to build fitness, but it also can delay your peaking. And because this is just the early competition period, the fear would be if we took that out, then as I implied, we might peak too early and then not be peaking later in the year when we need to be at our best. And in fact, if in the early competition period you take out the intensive tempo, you might just start getting more and more out of shape. So you might not only peak early, but then you might start declining rapidly afterward. So that's the general idea I went with when I was setting out this training. And the important thing to keep in mind with all of these workouts is there are a ton of different ways to do it. It all just depends on the specific athlete, what their goals are, what their training history is, and what their genetics are. Now, if you want to see some more potential weekly setups, both for 400 meter sprinters and for 100 and 200 meter sprinters, I have a link in the description with a free download. You can go check that out and get multiple different example setups for different purposes. At the end of the day, there's a million different ways you can do this. And so if you want, you can look at those examples, piece together the things you like and the things you don't like, and find what you think would work best for you in your particular body, in your particular situation. Now, I know I threw a lot of information at you, so if you want help with your own training and want to make sure you don't miss out on any potential gains, I'm offering a huge summer discount on my training right now. So if you want to be coached by me, I would love to try to help you reach your goals.